Michael Cremo, welcome aboard Bendiksen Airways.
Good to be with you, Alex.
Excellent. So, we've been told, or I've been told all my life, that humans are, or modern humans are around 200,000 years plus minus. What's your view on that?
Well, now the mainstream view is about 300,000, but so they're taking small steps in the right direction, but I think they have a long way to go. As far as I can see, humans have been present for far longer periods of time than that, going back in some cases many millions of years.
Wow. How? What makes you come to that conclusion?
Well, a few things. One was my exposure to the Vedic teachings of ancient India, which include a set of works called the Puranas or the histories. And they speak of a very ancient human presence on Earth going back very far in time. It was something completely different than anything I learned from my teachers in high school. I guess you call it gymnasium or university. So that got me looking into the history of archaeology because I was wondering, are the statements in these ancient books, are they some kind of mythology, or is there perhaps some factual basis for the statements of extreme human antiquity that are found in these literatures? Not just in the ones coming out of India, but in many of the different ancient wisdom traditions, whether we're talking about the Egyptian or the Chinese or the Mayan people in Central America, they all tend to have a very ancient human presence on Earth. So I wondered, is that just mythology or is there some factual basis for it? And that got me looking into the history of archaeology. And if you look in the current textbooks of archaeology, you don't see any evidence for extreme human antiquity. You see only reports that support the now dominant idea that humans like us appeared fairly recently on this planet. But I decided, let me look in beyond the textbooks into the original scientific literature, the primary scientific literature, reports by scientists published in their professional scientific journals. And when I did that, I was surprised to find many reports of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that go much further back in time than 200 or 300,000 years.
Before we continue down this path, how would you introduce yourself?
Uh, some people call me the Forbidden Archaeologist, which I took up. I actually wrote a column under that title for Atlantis Rising magazine for a few years. But I consider myself to be a researcher in alternative archaeology, focusing on evidence for extreme human antiquity.
And what is your background?
Uh, it's interesting because I don't have a background in professional archaeology, yet somehow or other I managed to establish some links of communication with professional archaeologists, and I presented many papers at meetings of the World Archaeological Congress, the European Association of Archaeologists, and other organizations. I've spoken at archaeology departments of many universities around the world. I've spoken on these topics at leading scientific institutions like the Royal Institution in London, the Russian Academy of Science in Moscow, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, and the Indian Institute for Science. So somehow or other, I managed to establish some communication. My books are reviewed in the professional scientific literature. So I'm kind of a self-taught person, but somehow or other, I managed to establish some links of communication with professional archaeology.
I see. Yeah. So what was the reason you started reading the ancient texts like the Bhagavad Gita?
Bhagavad Gita. Um, well, when I was younger, when I was a young person, I was living with my family. My father was an intelligence officer in the United States Air Force. And when I was a teenager, I was going to an American high school in Germany. And on my vacations, I wanted to visit many places in Europe. So on one vacation, I went to Stockholm and I was staying in a youth hostel there. And I met some European young people who had traveled overland to India and then come back. And they were also staying in this youth hostel. And they told me of their experiences of India, going into Kashmir and places like that, going into the Himalayas, meeting different yogis and mystics. And I was fascinated by the accounts and decided I wanted to go there myself someday. Of course, it's not really possible to travel the way they did these days. It was a different time, and it was possible to go across Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, uh, Pakistan, and then into India. Uh, so I went that route myself a couple of times. So, and of course, to prepare myself for visiting, I began to read some of the Vedic texts. So I found in them not just information about human history, but the nature of the self as something different than the body made of the material elements, that there's a conscious self that can exist apart from the body. There's reincarnation, the laws of karma, think other ideas that I have found very helpful in my life.
So kind of a spiritual journey as well.
Yeah. Yeah, in forbidden archaeology, basically I'm talking about stones and bones, but it leads quite naturally to other questions about the nature of what a human being is. Who are we really? People would ask me, okay, they'd read my book, Forbidden Archaeology, which presents archaeological discoveries that contradict the current picture of human origins and antiquity. And people would ask, well, what does that mean? What's the significance? What difference does it make? And the difference that it makes is that we need new explanations for human origins. And I think those new explanations have to involve consciousness. And that takes you into a new realm of science. Today, most scientists would try to explain consciousness as a byproduct of the interactions of neurons in the brain. In other words, matter produces consciousness.
Yeah.
That hasn't worked out very well for them. They've been working on this for 150 years since Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859. He admitted consciousness is a big problem. How does it come about? He said that's a question for scientists in the distant future to deal with. Well, the distant future is here and is still a problem, an unsolved problem. So I think eventually this is already starting to happen. Some scientists are beginning to understand that consciousness is something different than matter. And it's not simply a byproduct. It seems to have its own fundamental existence.
So do you see consciousness as the fundamental reality?
Yes, ultimately. And there's a further distinction that I make. Not only is consciousness its own reality, it's individual, it's personal. In other words, it's particulate in a way. It's almost like the fact that matter can exist as particles or as waves, as scientists are dealing with in quantum mechanics. There's some puzzling aspects of uh, the nature of consciousness that as we experience consciousness, it's individual and personal. I have my consciousness, you have yours. In some sense, there's some common feature to it, but still, we each have our own distinct perspective, first person, subjective perspective on things. That's what we experience. Technically, in consciousness studies, this is called the boundary problem. So I think there's a whole science of consciousness that needs to be explored.
Interesting. So what? So are we? Is your view that we as humans, our brain perhaps taps into that universal consciousness?
Uh, yes, I I believe that it is possible. Uh, I find that scientists are coming around. They're getting close to this sort of conclusion themselves. Uh, the I attended recently in July, well, a couple of months ago, a meeting of the Science of Consciousness group in Barcelona, Spain. And now many of them are starting to propose that on a certain level, consciousness is a property of matter, that matter and consciousness are two sides of the same coin. So it's called property dualism. And I think that's a step in the right direction.
Well, what about other things than humans? Do they have consciousness as well? Other animals, plants, etc.
Yes, I believe that is so. There have been interesting studies done on plants, for example, that they appear to be able to communicate with each other. For example, the plants in a garden or a forest will be able to detect when, say, a fire is approaching, and they'll send signals that are picked up by other plants in the neighborhood. There have been studies done showing those kinds of sensory capabilities and communication capabilities, even on the level of plants. There have also been studies of microorganisms, single-celled organisms, which display very interesting behaviors. You can look at them and you can see they're pursuing food, they're avoiding um, different toxins that could damage them. They appear to be acting in a conscious way. So, yeah, ultimately, I think every living entity is ultimately a conscious entity.
If we go back to the archaeological part of this or side of this, what kind of evidence is there, physical evidence, that we are millions of years older than the established thinking?
Well, to really answer that question, we have to understand the process of knowledge filtration. That means, and this is not a new idea that I invented, this is something that's been understood by philosophers of science and historians of science for a long time. For example, there was Thomas Kuhn, uh, historian of science, who wrote a very influential book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He is the one who popularized the term paradigm. A paradigm means a methodology and a set of conclusions that a particular discipline of science has arrived at. And evidence that conforms to the dominant paradigm will be discussed and debated and displayed in the scientific world. If there is evidence that contradicts a paradigm, that's what Kuhn would call an anomaly, anomalous evidence. And it doesn't fit the paradigm, so it's set aside. We'll get to that later. For now, we'll just put it aside. But sometimes what happens is that enough anomalies accumulate that it becomes impossible to ignore them. And at that point, there could be a paradigm shift. In other words, there would have to be some new paradigm that incorporated the anomalous evidence, but also explains what had been accepted before. So I'll give an example of how this works in practice from a recent example from a recent case in archaeology. In 2016, a group of archaeologists and other scientists published a report about a discovery that was made at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And it's a minor discovery in one sense. It was of a finger bone. Actually, it was, each finger is made of 3 bones. So they found the proximal or the lower bone of the small finger of some kind of creature who lived, human-like creature who lived 1,800,000 years ago. So they very carefully measured the bone, and they took those measurements and using computer algorithms compared them with the same measurements of the same bone from different species of hominids, like Australopithecus, Homo erectus, and so on. They also compared it with the same bone from a sample of apes and monkeys, gorillas, chimpanzees, and so on. And they also compared it with the measurements of the same bone from a modern human population. When I say the same bone, I mean several, 20 or 30 finger bones from human population. And their analysis showed that it fits squarely in the modern human group. But the in the publication, that this was published in Nature Communications, which is a major international, highly respected scientific journal, they said in their report, this finger bone, the OH86, technically that was its name, is its designation, OH86. This OH86 finger bone falls squarely in the modern Homo sapiens type, but we can't call it Homo sapiens because of the geological age of the formation in which it was found, 1,800,000 years. So this is what I would call the knowledge filtering process in operation. Scientists find a bone, they say it's not like that of any known hominin or species of ape and monkey. It's exactly like the finger bones of anatomically modern humans, but we can't call it human because of its age. It must be something else. So that's what often happens. Either a discovery like that will be rejected, or it will be interpreted in such a way that it fits the dominant paradigm. And if that happened just once or twice, maybe you could overlook it. But what I showed in my book, Forbidden Archeology, and its sequel, Extreme Human Antiquity, which came out earlier this year, I showed we're not talking about just a few cases. We're talking about many such cases. If we look at the whole history of archaeology, we can see this process has been going on for a long time. So the way I look at it is we're not getting all of the facts, all of the information that we need to make decisions about important questions related to human origins and human antiquity. Once I was speaking in Amsterdam at the Free University of the Netherlands of Amsterdam, and my audience was graduate students of geology, paleontology, and archaeology. And I told them, you should be aware of the entire data set that's relevant to your field of study. And I'll leave it up to you to divide up that data set, what's useful, what looks very suspicious, and what is maybe yes, maybe no. You divide up the data set, but don't throw any of it away, because something that doesn't make sense at the present moment may become meaningful in light of new discoveries. And I think that's the case. So I was making that case to them. not that they have to immediately accept everything I say as demonstrating in every single case that humans existed in very distant periods of time. But I think the case is reasonable enough that, well, it could be possible. But if you throw it out, then yes, you can say, well, there's no evidence to support what you say because you dismissed it, kind of using a double standard, which if you apply to the evidence that they accept for their point of view, that humans appeared fairly recently, that evidence wouldn't survive the kind of treatment that they give this other category of evidence. So those are a few thoughts on the forbidden archaeology topic.
How do you then square this with evolution, Charles Darwin?
Well, I think Charles Darwin had some interesting ideas. He was aware that something was changing uh, in the course of reproduction. There was some variation, and he just didn't know what it really was that is evolving. He thought it was the physical body that was evolving, changing into from one species to another. But if we actually look at the fossil record, we don't see one species changing to another. We find in the fossil record that a kind of plant or animal will appear in the fossil record at a certain point in time. It will continue for a certain point of time and then disappear from the fossil record. No transitions from one to another. And paleontologists have admitted that. And some people came up with a theory called punctuated equilibrium to explain why it was like that. But and there are major gaps in the scientific explanations for the origin of different body types. If we look at the different phyla, the different basic kinds of body structures, you have creatures who are like worm-like creatures. They're one body plan. There are things like starfish, a radial body. That's another type of body. There's the insect body, 6 legs, the arachnid or spider body with 8, the quadruped mammals, clams, shellfish. There are different body types, and there's no real explanation how those different body types have come into existence. And this is just admitted. If you go on the web and search, say, for unsolved problems in biology, you'll see all these things come up. So I think Darwin had a good intuition that something was evolving from one stage of life to the next. So I think what he was missing is the conscious self, because it's the conscious self which survives the death of the body that migrates to another physical body In other words, there's a whole library of possible embodiments for a conscious self based on its state of awareness. I mean, sometimes we talk colloquially about, oh, that person is such a dog. It behaves just like a dog or something. Well, if that is, we take that a little bit seriously, you see, well, maybe in the next incarnation, that's what it will be. Or maybe it was in a past life. So I would say it's the evolution of consciousness that is the main topic in evolution, not the transformation of one physical form of body into another.
So in other words, you don't believe that chimpanzees and humans have a common ancestor?
Well, yeah, that's what I believe, but I think beyond belief, I think I can justify that in the sense that if we actually look at the complete fossil record and not just the carefully edited portion of the fossil record that's put into today's textbooks, we'll see there's a coexistence of humans like us, humans corresponding to the different types of ancestral human hominids that scientists speak about, different forms of ape men. And then there are apes and monkeys. And one could argue that they coexist, and that coexistence goes very far back in time. When I first published Forbidden Archeology, actually it was in 1993, at that time, scientists had a very linear perception of human origins. They thought, okay, you have the Australopithecus type of creature, and that's the only hominid around. And then there comes Homo habilis, who lived maybe 2 to 3 million years ago. And then there's Homo erectus that existed from maybe 1.8 million to maybe 500,000 or 600,000 years ago. And then came the Neanderthals, and then Homo sapiens, very linear. Now they have a different idea. In Forbidden Archaeology, we proposed that a long time ago that there were different types of human-like creatures coexisting with each other on this planet. And now that's the mainstream scientific point of view, that you've got the Denisovans, the Neanderthals, anatomically modern humans, different species like Homo floresiensis from the Flores Island site in Indonesia. They call it the Hobbit, the creature that was found there, all coexisting. So it's a much more complicated picture.
Very interesting. So what would a mainstream archaeologist, how would a debate between you look like? How would he counter your arguments?
Uh, well, one common tactic is, and I've seen this actually in practice, is to give a list of possible ways in which a discovery could be wrong. Uh, so like a typical response to a particular case would be, say if you have a human bone or a human artifact that's found in a very, very ancient layer of rock, they could say, well, and this has happened to me once. I was in Denmark. I was in Copenhagen, and they I was giving a lecture, and an archaeologist was present. It wasn't a lecture at a university. It was held in a hall in the town. But yeah, some archaeologists came, and they during the question session, one of them wanted to be recognized to put a question to me. And I recognized him, and he said, well, very interesting, Mr. Cremo, but don't you know that there are many ways in which this discovery could be wrong? The artifact could have slipped down through some fissure in the rock. There could have been some earth movement and things got mixed up, or the scientist who was involved in the discovery made a mistake. He got the age of the formation wrong, or actually that the presence of that bone or artifact in that very ancient layer must have been the result of intrusive burial. In other words, someone died at some recent level, and friends or relatives dug a grave and put the bone down in that very ancient layer. So that is probably the most common way that archaeologists would do that. So I replied to this particular archaeologist first by saying, well, it's possible you're a holographic projection from Mars. I mean, if we're going to talk about things that are possible, anything is possible. But I think if you're going to proceed in a scientific way, you would have to show that at this particular place, there actually is a fissure that goes down. And there are human bones or human artifacts at the higher level that did, in fact, go down through that fissure. Or another common thing to include in the list is hoaxes. Well, it's obviously a hoax. So that's the kind of thing I experience. If somebody actually does have some scientific reason to criticize one of the cases that I bring up, I'm willing to accept that. If somebody can actually show me, a valid, scientifically justified reason, and not just some laundry list of possibilities, they can actually show what occurred to cause the mistaken identification to be made, I'll accept that.
Yeah.
But that isn't how it usually goes. I remember at the Russian Academy of Sciences, after my talk there, I was invited to give a talk there. And one of the archaeologists said, I haven't read your book, but I'm sure everything in it is either a mistake, a hoax, or an illusion. So that type of reaction is the most common response to my work that I've seen from scientists. And
I get it.
I have had debates with them. I remember once in Budapest, I was invited to debate an archaeologist at one of the universities in Budapest in Hungary. And I gave my presentation, and the other party gave his presentation, which didn't address any of my points, but just rehearsed or repeated the standard theory of human evolution. And during the discussion section that followed, one of the Hungarian scientists said to this person, "You really haven't done a very good job in countering this man's evidence." So I thought that was interesting. But sometimes I don't like to do debates because it seems to me everyone who goes in in the audience. Very few people are persuaded to shift their points of view in a setting like that. They tend to stick to their own points of view. I will do debates.
What did you think of Graham Hancock's Ancient Apocalypse, if you've seen it?
Well, I have seen some of it. He is an alternative archaeology researcher, as I am. I've known him for a long time. He wrote a very nice introduction to my book, The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is the abridged version of Forbidden Archeology. Forbidden Archeology is 900 pages, which causes some people to call it forbidding archaeology. So forbidding, you don't want to pick it up. But so we brought out an abridged
Have it
version.
here.
Yeah. Well, that's Forbidden Archaeology. That's the 900 pages.
Yeah, it is.
You can use that to work out, if you
It's true.
kind of heavy in more ways than one. But he called that book one of the landmark intellectual achievements of the late 20th century. So I I know him, but he is his own man. Although we're both dealing with forbidden archaeology in the sense that we're exploring ideas that are different from the conclusions in the mainstream archaeological circles. But I'm more or less dealing with deep time, the origin of our species, and he's more concerned with the more recent developments like the origin of civilization. The standard idea is that until 10,000 years ago, human beings existed only as hunter-gatherers. There was no villages, no domesticated animals, no agriculture. People would just wander around in small bands, hunting and gathering wild plants. So the change that took place 10,000 years ago, they called the Neolithic, and it begins with village life. And gradually, political a political class arises, chiefs or rulers of these villages, and they start getting bigger, turning into urban settlements under a larger system of government and control. And you get civilizations like coming into existence maybe 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. So my understanding of what he's trying to do is show that the origin of civilization goes back much further than that. And he's kind of starting from that end of the spectrum, showing that in the period between maybe 20,000 and 50,000 years ago, there's evidence for civilization that goes beyond the hunter-gatherer stage. So, so we're on, you could say, parallel paths. I last saw him maybe last year in Sedona, Arizona, where he was giving a talk.
I see. Who do you think built the pyramids?
Well, I'm not a pyramid expert, but it shows whoever built them. If you look at the measurements of it, look at the dimensions of it, the alignments to different celestial phenomena, it's clear that whoever built it had an advanced knowledge of technology, of astronomy, of geophysics. So whoever built it probably did it earlier than we now think, or some people now think, or it may have involved, just the sheer mass of the pyramids is just amazing. How all those huge blocks of stone were quarried and moved to that site and elevated and put in place. It's really a masterwork. Another feature of not necessarily the pyramids, but there are these stone vessels that have been found at Giza, along with the pyramids and in other places, that are very finely manufactured. You may have a vase, stone vase with practically paper thin stone walls on them. I saw a collection of these. There's a gentleman, Matt Beall, in Florida, who runs a podcast and also runs a family business. But he's got a collection of about 400 of these Egyptian stone vases. I first heard about them from John Anthony West many years ago. And it was really interesting to see such a large collection of them. And, it's practically impossible for stone workers today to duplicate the kinds of things that they were able to produce. So whoever they were pretty advanced.
Yeah. Are you noticing a shift in how the scientific and maybe spiritual communities respond to your work in recent?
Yeah. Well, what I've noticed is in the field of consciousness studies, it's becoming more and more common among the professionals involved in these things to either listen to or themselves speak about knowledge from different ancient wisdom traditions impacting their studies, and they're willing to admit, taking insights from these wisdom sources that they find useful in their scientific research. Um, you know, and I found, I mean, all of these things in my mind are related. You know, all these fields of alternative science and mainstream science, I think they're all related. One example I've seen is one thing I talk about, a subject that I talk about based on my studies in the Puranas, is the existence of vimanas, spacecraft, aircraft described in the ancient texts that in such a manner that they resemble modern reports of UFOs or UAPs, as they're called now, unidentified aerial phenomena. You know, I regularly go to meetings of the World Archaeological Congress, one of the world's largest international organizations of archaeologists. I went to a meeting this year. It's held every 4 years. This year it was held in uh, Darwin, Australia. And previous to that, 4 years ago, it was held in Prague. So I go to these major international conferences on archaeology, and I was surprised some years ago to see that they the archaeologists were discussing extraterrestrial archaeology. Uh, in one sense, they're talking about, well, what are we going to do when we go to the moon and we find remains of things that we on Earth have sent there? Who's it going to, who will it belong to? Whose museum will get it? And there are actual treaties and agreements being negotiated and have been negotiated over the past couple of decades about these things. But another thing they're talking about is what will we do if we find things that we didn't send there?
Mm.
You know, what are the implications of that? So it's kind of interesting for me. You know, it's a change that I've seen, that a lot of topics that were once considered fringe are now being actively discussed by professional archaeologists in their professional gatherings. So that's an interesting development that I've seen.
I've read most of Eric von Daniken's books. What is your view on his work?
Well, he's an interesting man. I've met him a few times. He invited me to speak at a conference he organized in Bern, Switzerland, some years ago. And uh, he's, you know, he's an interesting man in that some people take his theories as a reason to say that uh, God is just an idea that people on earth came up with when they experienced contacts with extraterrestrial beings who came to this planet.
Yeah.
I don't know if he actually believes that himself, because I've spoken to him about it. That, you know, the two things aren't necessarily contradictory. Uh, yes, there can be extraterrestrial beings somewhat like us from other planets on this dimension of reality that have technology superior to ours. That doesn't mean that there's not some ultimate source of everything, you know, God. You know, that's So I think that's the big question I have for Eric von Daniken and his followers, because I think there is kind of sort of like a cosmic hierarchy of beings. There are beings within the cosmos who have higher abilities than we do in terms of the technologies that they use. But that doesn't rule out the existence of some being who's superior to them even, and who is ultimately in control of things.
Yeah. How do you see the future now of archaeology and the search for human origins?
Well, things are moving in my direction. They keep pushing the age of uh, Homo sapiens further and further back in time. So to me, that's a positive development. And now they're kind of constrained by their overall picture. They have certain timelines for the existence of various human ancestors. But as things get pushed further and further back in time, they may be compelled to change that basic framework. So whether that happens or not depends upon uh, the alternative researchers being able to convince them uh, to do that. And that means there's work that people like me or whoever follows me when I'm gone will have to go a little bit further to convince them of these things. Like, there's a historian of science who wrote a book called Minority Report, in which he explored the idea of what minority group in science shows the potential to become the next majority. In other words, if you look at the history of science, you can see there's always been some dominant paradigm. And then there have been a few people who have minority opinions. And sometimes it happens that one of those minority groups, minority in terms of their theory and the amount of people who accept it,
Yeah.
in comparison with the mainstream theory, how do you determine which one is going to succeed in becoming the next mainstream theory? And I think he examined my work in that context, which I thought was really good. But he made the point that it's the group that is able not only to pile up evidence that contradicts the current theory, but to come up with a competing theory that uh, accommodates the anomalous evidence and solves some problem that the mainstream theory has been unable to solve. So in terms of the future, I think that is the key. Of course, if if one wants one's view to be the mainstream view accepted by all the elite circles in the society in which one lives, I think that sort of thing is necessary. Just pointing out the anomalies it's important, but it's not enough. What needs to be done is come up with a new theoretical outlook. And I did that or made a step towards that in my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory. After Forbidden Archeology was published, scientists reviewed it in their professional literature. And one thing one scientist said, when you challenge a dominant theory, you should give an alternative that you're going to put in its place. And my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory, was my answer to that question. And so, I mean, the short answer to your question, what is the future? I think the future is to not only pile up evidence that contradicts the current theories, but come up with an alternative explanation for human origins that incorporates that evidence plus the evidence that's used to support the current dominant paradigm.
Yeah. Michael, one final question. What is the meaning of life?
Life is not chemicals. We aren't accidental creatures in an accidental universe. We're not machines made of molecules. The actual living thing is the conscious self. Everything else is dead matter. So that understanding of what life is means understanding the difference between the actual living entity, the conscious self, and the vehicle made of material elements that conscious self is occupying. And that is the real purpose of human life, to understand that principle. What is actually living? Because it's not the collection of atoms and molecules that make up the material bodily vehicle that we're now occupying. The actual living element, life-giving force, is the conscious self.
Mr. Cremo, thank you for speaking to me.
Well, thank you for letting me fly on your airline.
My pleasure. Tusen takk for at du hørte på Bendiksen Airways. Dersom du har tips, kommentarer eller vil gi en vurdering av episoden, så gjør gjerne det. Det setter jeg stor pris på.